This episode is brought to you by Brennan and the 2025 iTnews State of Security Report. Stay tuned until the end to hear from Peter Soulsby, the head of cybersecurity at Brennan, on how to protect information and system assets by strengthening endpoint security. Hello and welcome to the iTnews podcast. Our guest this fortnight is Rob Walter, the Director of the Agriculture Statistics Program at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The ABS is increasingly aggregating government and third-party data sources to build out its understanding of agriculture. This is important not just for Australia's national accounts, but increasingly as an intelligence source for farmers to tap into to optimise what they are doing based on what is working in other parts of the country. We start by discussing data collection challenges at the Bureau and how their data journey is continuing to evolve.
I suspect everyone knows the Australian Bureau of Statistics, but can you introduce us to the agricultural data collection side of the organisation, what it's looking for and what key data points are getting tracked?
The ABS agriculture statistics really focus around production and value of agriculture. We also include information about land use and water use, as well as agricultural business counts. And that covers a wide range of agricultural products, everything from livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, that sort of thing, broadacre crops, so wheat, barley, cotton, and horticulture, which is fruit and vegetables and things like that we find in our supermarkets. The production and value in particular are important because they feed into our national accounts. The agriculture statistics are also one of the longest running ABS data sets. Our agriculture statistics go right back to 1860. The ABS was formed in 1905, but at that time they compiled data from the different states that went right back to 1860. Last year we released some data that painted that picture from 1860 right up to 2022 of the way agriculture had changed, and it was pretty interesting. You could see the invention of things like stump jump plough and how that improved wheat production, and there's been a real rise and fall of sheep numbers in Australia relating to things like droughts and the price of wool. It's interesting to see how it's changed over time.
Where or how does the ABS typically get hold of this agricultural data? How is it collected?
Before 2022, we primarily collected this data through large agricultural surveys. Every 5 years, we ran the agricultural census, and that went out to about 100,000 farmers. In the intervening years, we ran a slightly smaller survey of around 25,000 farmers. In addition to that, we also ran some value surveys that went to some of the processors like cotton mills, for example. But in 2023, we made the decision to cease those large agricultural surveys and move to a range of other existing data sources. And that decision was basically because we'd been struggling with the ability to get good response rates from farmers and the increasing costs that had entailed. That's a challenge statistical organisations across the world have been facing. It's not just with agriculture, it's across a whole range of different types of surveys. The other reason we decided to make the change is because a lot of these other existing data sets that we were aware of are able to better produce regional data because of the additional detail. And more there's a demand to understand what's happening at a regional perspective with agriculture, not just what's the total value of wheat and how much wheat did we produce in Australia, but where is that being produced and how is that changing and how is it being impacted by climate. That change from using large surveys to existing data sources has massively reduced the burden on farmers, which is one thing farmers are very happy about, but it's been a huge challenge to make that switch.
Just go back to the way that data was collected. So you had the one in every 5 year census. You had interim surveys every year that were with a smaller sample size of farmers. Is the ask for the amount of data and the amount of time that would be put into collecting for agricultural purposes similar to the ask on every Australian on Census 9?
It probably took farmers longer to complete that agricultural census than it did for me to complete my population and housing census. That's one of the challenges for farmers and this agricultural data. Farmers, it's a pretty tough job, and the last thing they want to do when they come inside at the end of the day is fill out a survey form, particularly when they know that some of that data has already existed in other reporting that they've done to government or other organisations.
You mentioned there's a lot of existing data sets that produce better regional data. Can you just explain the step change or the difference that you were looking at here? Because I imagine you were able to produce at some level a regional perspective on some of these statistics based on an aggregation of the data that you were already collecting. But what's the big difference? Is it in how specific you're able to go? Is it in a bigger sample size? What's the change?
One of the main reasons we ran that agricultural census, which went to over 100,000 farms as opposed to 25,000 in the intervening years, was to get that regional picture of agriculture. The problem is if you're only getting that regional picture once every 5 years, a lot can happen in the space of 5 years. You can have a big drought that might last for 3 or 4 years and you don't see how that impacts that area. But with some of these new data sources like satellite crop mapping or the data that farmers produce when they pay levies, that covers all agricultural businesses that are selling wheat, for example, or all the area in Australia where wheat is being grown in the case of the satellite crop mapping. And so when you've got those data sources that are covering closer to the entire production of that commodity, there's capability to produce those statistics faster, but also with that extra regional detail.
Some of those data sources that you mentioned there, so around satellite and crop mapping and the other data produced around levies, were some of these supplementary sources already part of your data mix? Were you able to already access these to cross-compare or to build on the data that you already were collecting as part of the census or as part of the one-year installments?
For the last 10 years or so, we've been aware of this increasing availability of other data sources, particularly as agriculture has started to make use of more and more technology. For example, some of that levy data, we've been using that in conjunction with the survey data to help us quality assure the survey data, or often you'd have missing responses in the survey data and you'd need to impute values, and we'd use some of those other data sources to help with that imputation process. And over the last 4 or 5 years, increasingly we've been starting to do some work looking at, well, how could we use these data sources to replace surveys? We'd produced a couple of experimental statistics using those different data sources as a demonstration of what they could look like. The big challenge with moving to these new data sources is they're designed for administrative purposes or other purposes than just producing statistics in most cases. And so you don't just go out there and find an administrative data set that perfectly replaces your survey. What you've got to do is come up with new methods of editing and combining these data sources to meet what you were producing from your survey if you want to stop that survey.
You mentioned at the start of the conversation around, I don't know if complexity was the word you used, but you mentioned there were some challenges around moving to this new model of data collection and data analysis. You've kind of just tipped on it there in terms of you produced some demonstrations over the last 4 or 5 years. Do you want to talk about maybe the evolution of how accurate you were able to get those demonstrations to replicate what you were doing? Or was that even the goal, to replicate what stats you had?
It's a good question, and one of the really important things we did when we started to think about moving to these existing data sources for producing statistics was that we really connected in with industry, and we set up these statistical working groups that were focused on particular parts of industry. One of the first ones we did was a red meat statistics working group. Basically what it did was bring together people from cattle, sheep industries to think about what are the best available data sources here and how can we use those to improve statistics. And that was in response to, with the declining response rates, that impacts the quality of statistics that are being produced, and people were starting to have concerns about that. That's why we started to look at how can we improve these statistics, what other data is out there, and how can we make sure that that data is making sense. We did that not just for livestock and red meat, but also for grains and horticulture. And the real benefit of that is that you had these experts within the industry who are aware of all these different data sources, the different companies producing data, the industry groups. And so they were able to give us a lot of information about what the data sets were designed for, how they might be able to feed into our statistics, what the quality of them was, what biases there might be in those data sets. And with that knowledge, we could assess those, work with the custodians of those data sources to get access to them, and then develop methods that edited some of the weaknesses in those data sets, but also use the data sets together to use the strength of one data set to edit a weakness in another data set. That could then produce quite high quality statistics very efficiently. And we did that in quite an incremental way so that we develop something, share the results with the industry working group, and they'd provide us feedback, and we'd go away and improve it and then bring it back. And we're still working through that process. Some of the statistics that we published last year, we know we can make small improvements to those processes to make them more efficient or maybe improve the regional detail a little bit. Those ongoing partnerships and working groups are something we envisage will continue into the future to support our ongoing understanding of the data and how we're using those data sets together.
In terms of the makeup of those working groups, did you have a certain idea of the valuable data sets that were out in the market and the ones that you thought you could get the most value from, at least initially?
What we did was we worked with Department of Agriculture and Australian Bureau of Agricultural Resources and Economics Sciences, ABARES, and the industry groups. So, for example, for livestock, that's Meat and Livestock Australia. And that was the starting point, those three. From their knowledge, we invited people in, and they're still evolving. They include state governments, they include academics, they include farmers or farmer industry reps. It's really important to have that broad perspective of users and people from across the industry because there's a lot of different factors you need to consider in using the data. For example, having farmers or farmer representatives on there ensures that the way we're using the data and the way we're ensuring it's confidential is a way that farmers are comfortable with. That's really important, having that mix of different people there.
We've connected over a specific geospatial data set, which I think you procure in partnership with Digital Agricultural Services, or DAS. Do you want to talk about the DAS data set and what it brings to the table?
The DAS data gives us information on major broadacre crops, things like wheat, barley, canola, cotton, rice. These crops are important because they're very high value crops in Australia. The value of all these broadacre crops is a big part of Australian agriculture. It would be around $30 billion, something like that. They also cover quite a big land area, which makes them very important as well. DAS give us quite detailed data about each of those crops in small areas. As I was mentioning before, that lets us produce very detailed regional statistics by using it together with the levy payer data that has information on the sale and the value of those different crops. The way DAS produce that data is using satellite data and a machine learning process. That methodology was originally developed by CSIRO, but they've continued to develop that over time, particularly by sourcing their own ground data that feeds into that machine learning process. And the way you do that and where you do that is a bit of an art that they've improved over time. They're not themselves a regular part of Grain's statistical working group, but we do quite often have them come along and talk to that working group about the data. We also have a very close partnership with them in the way we use the data and the information they provide to us. So they don't just give us the data, they also give us statistics about the accuracy of that data and the reliability. Some geographic areas have better reliability than others, and that extra information helps us plan how we use it together with the levy payer register data. And the other thing about the partnership is if we see something doesn't quite make sense in the data or that we have questions about, they're very open. We'll go and have a conversation with them. And over time, we've seen quite big improvements in the quality of that data over the last 5 years. And a lot of that's just due to their own work on improving that method. But it's really nice to have that partnership to help us understand the data. And also now, the other thing we still have a data gap on is understanding hay production, and that's something we've started to talk to them about, and they're working on methods to be able to identify where crops are cut for hay rather than cut and sold as grain. So by having that partnership, we're able to further develop new statistics to fill remaining data gaps.
And is that just based purely on, for example, satellite imagery of bales in the paddocks? Or
it's more around the timing of when the crops are cut. The timing is different when you're cutting it for hay versus grain. The way you detect one crop versus another uses a whole series of satellite data over time and looks at how that crop changes over time, and that's how you can tell difference between wheat or barley. Lots of people would probably struggle to tell the difference between wheat and barley just standing next to a paddock, so being able to do it from satellite data is pretty impressive.
We've mentioned one partner. Are there any other key partners that you work with from a data perspective?
Yeah, we've got a very wide range of data partners. So we've got around 20 different data sets or more that we use, and that spans industry data sets, those industry groups who provide us data. The levy payer register data that I mentioned before is an extremely important one. We also get data from some state governments, and also now we're starting to work a bit with farm software companies as well to access data from them too. So there's a pretty wide range, and that's part of the challenge, is that the method we use for producing those crops like wheat and barley, by combining the DAS satellite crop mapping and the levy payer register, is very different to the methods that we're using to produce statistics on the number of cattle in Australia, which has changed to a model that's a bit like the model used to estimate the population. So we try and understand births, we've got data on deaths, and we've got some data on movements, and so we build that into a model to understand the cattle population.
One question on the editing methods that the ABS has developed to, bring these data sets together, and also to do the gap analysis in terms of understanding how you might be able to splice different pieces of data together to either do the cross-checks or to fill gaps in to create this complete data set for each of these agricultural domains. In corporate data, especially whenever we talk about combining data, there's a huge amount of variance in data fields and even in the terminology used to collect data. And I imagine this must be a pretty interesting challenge for you in terms of you're dealing with a lot of different industry partners and a lot of different organizations that have come up with their own definitions and terminologies and things. How are you cross-matching all this stuff?
Yeah, that's partly why these statistical working groups are so important to help us understand those things. There's a few sort of key variables used in ag businesses, and obviously ABN is one of those in understanding a business. There's also property information codes that relate to livestock and livestock movements. So we can use some of those key unique identifiers to help aggregate data. The other one is location, and increasingly now we're using a lot of geographic information systems and spatial data to link data together. So a lot of the data sets will have information on address, which gives you a good idea of where the property is, but agricultural properties are quite complex. They're huge, and they're often not just in one location. You might have some farm paddocks in one area and then a bunch of farm paddocks 30 kilometres away as well. And so that's why the satellite data from DAS is really valuable, because it helps us understand with greater spatial detail where those crops are. In the past, we'd often get statistics which a business address is often in a regional town, and then their farm paddocks will be in that surrounding area. So if you're just using address to produce statistics, well, those statistics will be appearing in that regional town, which is obviously not right, but we didn't have any other data to help us understand exactly where they are. And so by using spatial data, and we've got some quite complex spatial reallocation processes that we've developed with our methodology and geospatial experts in ABS that can move that data from a town out to the surrounding area where the satellite data tells us where that crop is being grown. It's one example of how we're linking together data, not just by a unique identifier, but by using a location.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about the structural change in terms of the change in data collection and that flowing onto analysis, and we've talked about partner support and the industry group support as well. What about your function internally as well? And there's maybe good to start with your role. How's your role changed in all of this? It's a big shift in the way that the function kind of operates. So how's your role changed, firstly?
I came from a geospatial background into agriculture statistics, and originally my role was working with a very small team of 3 or 4 people looking at how we could use some of these new data sources to produce statistics. And so I was working with a small team, and we were working together with a much larger team that was still running surveys and producing agriculture statistics. After COVID, basically, we were really struggling to get response rates. The survey we ran and had very poor response rates to the point where we couldn't produce some statistics. We didn't produce any water use statistics. We couldn't produce statistics about a lot of the horticulture commodities because the response rates were too low. And at the same time, the ABS was really being pushed to produce greater detail about economic statistics. So they started using ATO tax data to produce monthly jobs and wages statistics. They'd started work to use supermarket scanner data and other data sets to support a monthly consumer price index. And so the agriculture budget is not a fixed budget, but it's some money that's allocated internally. And so changing that process enabled some of those other work around jobs and wages and CPI to happen as well. So we went from a total agriculture team was probably 45 people, and it's now, we combine those teams and move to that existing data sources. It's now around 15 people spread across Hobart, Melbourne, Canberra and Brisbane. And for that team, it's been a big change as well, because they've gone from following a very fixed, established process using this survey to produce statistics to a bit of a change in skills they need, where engaging with these industry groups is really important. We're developing new methods, working with our geospatial and methodology people and using SAS code or code for the geospatial software to produce the statistics. The team's been amazing in making that adaptation, and it's improving the speed in which they can produce the statistics. It's been really awesome and very rewarding to see that change that they've made.
Were there any specific ways you were able to support them in making that adaptation?
One of the things that we did a lot of workshops, and we came together because we were spread out in different locations. We tried to come together to work through those processes. But by and large, I think because the change happened so quickly as well, the team really weren't on the job, and we had some people in the team that were really great at engaging with industry, and others learned from them. We had some people in the team who were already good at using spatial data, and others learned those skills from them. And so it's been a bit of an evolution, but it's something that we're focusing on a bit more now around what those new skills are that we need to solidify and how we build that.
Just one final question, I guess, from me. You obviously using some data analytics techniques either yourselves or through some of the partner arrangements. We talked about DAS and their machine learning capabilities. Do you see any further shifts or trends in the data analytics space that might create some additional opportunities or challenges in your particular space?
Yeah, I think one of the real opportunities is around farm software. And I mentioned before, increasingly farmers are using more technology and more data in the way they manage their farms. And often farm software is a really important part of managing that data and helping them to make decisions. And we've already started working with a few farm software companies to access aggregate data that helps us understand things like fertility rates in cattle herds. But I think there's a real opportunity to work with a wider range of those farm software companies and be able to sort of bring together large volumes of data about a range of different factors and provide that information back to farmers. A lot of the data that we're producing at the moment is primarily used by government and industry to look at things like biosecurity risks, understand the impacts in natural disasters and provide emergency funding back to farmers to improve infrastructure or processing facilities for getting food to markets. But very little of that data goes directly to a farmer to help them make decisions on their farm. And potentially we could look at things like some of the sustainability practices that different farms are doing, look at that together with the economic data from the farms and understand what practices are linked with greater resilience when there's droughts or greater farm profitability, and then provide that back to, say, wheat sheep farmers in a certain region and say, look, farmers in your region that are farming the same sorts of crops as you that do this have better profitability, and then that gives those farmers information to improve how they might run their farm. I reckon that that's one future opportunity that we have, and farmers in particular, they're facing the challenges of changing climate, changing trade conditions, and giving them information to improve the sustainability and profitability of their farms is something I think would be really good, and there's a real opportunity with some of these farm software companies now.
Look at almost any cybersecurity breach or incident, and you're almost certain to trace the beginning of the issue to something that happened on an endpoint. Whether that's a compromised password or exploited vulnerability, there's a good chance the issue started at an endpoint and that the risk could have been mitigated. Peter Soulsby is the head of cybersecurity at Brennan. He says there are 3 big issues he's seeing on endpoints today.
The first is end users installing unauthorized software. The second big issue we're seeing is end users being duped into providing access or credentials into an endpoint through social media, through phishing, through various different means today that allows threat actors to get onto endpoints and access software. The third issue that we're seeing is legacy software running on endpoints as opposed to the more advanced behavioral and analytical software or endpoint protection platforms that we see today. Good endpoint security is a combination of 2 things. Firstly, endpoints being well managed, and secondly, enabling users to do what they need to do in a safe manner. What we recommend to any business is make sure that every endpoint in your business is managed by someone, if that's you or if that's your partner, MSP, SI, making sure that everything in your business has someone accountable for managing it. It means your endpoints are patched, it means they're managed, it means they are up to date with modern software, with modern applications, and it means that anything on the endpoint that shouldn't be there is generally taken off. Unmanaged endpoints become vulnerable very quickly. Users will find a way to get around controls if they don't make it easier to do their job for them. So in every consideration you have in protecting your endpoints, make sure that you're enabling your users to do their jobs and do so efficiently. Making sure that security awareness training is alive and well in your business will also strengthen your endpoint security by making users more aware of what they can and can't do, or should and shouldn't do on the endpoints, and acting in a more secure manner.
With so many cybersecurity incidents in the news, organisations might feel overwhelmed in trying to determine the best way to protect their information and system assets. Peter says it's possible to strengthen endpoint security by following some straightforward advice.
Firstly, don't get sucked into conventional wisdom. Secondly, don't get pulled into every direction that hits the news. And thirdly, be aware of all the different things that you're going to be asked to do and choose the right thing to do for your business. If I touch on the first one, conventional wisdom, there are many different things you can do out there. There's going to be a lot of advice you get. There's got to be a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Find what's right for you. Assess the costs and the benefits of every cybersecurity solution and process, and make sure that it's fit for purpose for your business, not fit for purpose for someone else's. The second one, avoid being pulled into protecting against every threat that hits the news. There's so many things out there. Sometimes you just got to take stock, sit back, and again, assess what's right for your business. If you try to protect yourself against everything, you're going to make your life a lot more complicated and harder, make it harder to protect your business as a result. With all those different standards out there and all the different noise in the market, so we talk about NIST and ISO 27001, Essential 8, and so on and so forth. There are so many frameworks out there. Again, pick what's right for you. Don't just do something because someone said you should do it.
With many organisations under financial pressure, finding the resources to protect information assets can be a challenge. But Peter says focus is critical.
There's probably 2 things I'd advise businesses who are struggling from a resourcing perspective. The first is to do less things well as opposed to trying to do many things poorly. And the second is finding a right partner for you that works for you as a business and understands your business. One of the things we see in cybersecurity all too often these days is organizations trying to do too much and not actually executing properly on all the things that they're doing. It's much better for a business to focus on 2 or 3 things at a time and do them really, really well, as opposed to spreading your resources too thin and trying to do 10 things badly. If you do things badly, that'll allow threat actors the time and the space to find vulnerabilities in your business and access your network and access your data. Second point around finding the right partner that works for you and someone understands your business. Again, much like everything in cybersecurity, there's so much you can do. You need a partner that really understands your business, is not going to try and sell you everything out there under the sun, does not work with fear, uncertainty, and out to try and scare you into doing things. You want someone who understands your business, understands your strategy, understands your resourcing, and works at a pace that's appropriate for your business.
Endpoint security is a critical element of a layered defense against cyber attacks. By focusing on your organization's risks, choosing solutions that are right for your specific needs, and working with trusted partners, organizations can minimize the risk of business disruption and data loss.
That's the episode for this fortnight. Stay tuned for the next episode. And for all the latest headlines and happenings in Australian technology news, head over to itnews.com.au.